Off the ball. This is News Talk.
100% perfection. I couldn't live with anything lower.
He wanted to do something that, hadn't been done by Prost, hadn't been done by Senna, hadn't been done by any of the drivers in recent history.
I got such a strong impression of how hard Michael was willing to work. And that transformed the team.
And what Schumacher achieved was absolutely incredible.
You're looking good. It's looking good. It's looking fantastic, Michael. Well done.
And you're welcome back to Off the Ball Saturday here on News Talk. John Duggan with you through until 5. Shane Hannon's back in studio with me to talk about the new Michael Schumacher documentary, which is on Netflix. I deliberately have not watched this, Shane, so you can fill me in and give us a sense. Obviously, it's a sad situation at the moment. Michael Schumacher had a brain injury skiing in the Alps in 2013, and the family cooperated with this documentary.
They did, and I'm still on the fence about how I feel about the documentary. It was enjoyable, and I think if you were a Formula One fan, you'd have enjoyed it. There are some gaps. There are some gaps for sure. And we know since that accident happened in December 2013, the skiing accident, there has been a lot of privacy around Michael Schumacher's condition. And the film answers some questions, but not all. Not that we should be prying into his private life or anything like that, but I guess fans looking on from the outside wanted maybe a little bit of insight. For the Formula One fan, you will enjoy it. Like the opening scene, and look, there will be a few spoilers here if you haven't seen it yet, but well worth watching. It's long. It's an hour and 53 or 4 minutes. It's feature length, this documentary film, Schumacher on Netflix. But the cinematography, the pictures in it are excellent. Like, it starts off with like a full lap of the Monaco Grand Prix, going through the tunnel, following Michael's car on just one complete lap with a bit of music, and ends in kind of a pattern as well of the same lap, but from the camera angle facing Michael's helmet. And it's a nice documentary, and it kind of highlights some of the rivalries he's had over the years, the famous rivalries as well, John. So worth a watch, I think. So they've spoken to his family about how he's been. They've spoken to his family, and like one of the lines that stood out from his wife Corina, towards the end of it, she said he's different, but he's here, which is, there's been drips and drabs of news information about Michael's condition since that accident 8 years ago, and that's probably the strongest line we've heard since, that Michael is different. He's no longer the Michael Schumacher that he was, but he is here. And some emotional scenes with his son Mick Schumacher as well, who is only around, I think he's 23 years of age now. He's a driver himself in Formula One for the Haas team. Looks like Michael as well, a young Michael Schumacher. And there's a really emotional line towards the end where he's saying, I think if myself and my dad had the opportunity to have a conversation now, we would have so much to talk about, because I'm a Formula One driver myself. And he said, I would give up everything just for that. And he kind of has to take a moment. He's clearly getting very emotional, his son Mick. But yeah, the family had a say, and there's lots of clearly family provided portraits and photographs and stuff that really add to it as well. But it's an emotional watch for a Michael Schumacher fan, I think, who started his career as a Formula One driver with Eddie Jordan's team. Yeah, that's one thing that I found interesting, that Eddie Jordan doesn't appear in the documentary. Now, there's a couple of archive interviews, interview clips, kind of paddock vox pop interviews done with him that are used. But for someone who had such a starring role in Michael's Formula One origin story, that felt like a gap. I felt like Eddie Jordan, and look, I don't know the reasons why Eddie Jordan wasn't in the documentary, but definitely was one gap for sure, because that origin and it goes into that, and it kind of very nicely details Michael's childhood years growing up in Germany, and his go-karting background, and the impact of his father Rolf as well. Had a karting. I mean, karting through and through was Michael, and for a lot of Formula One drivers, even current drivers like Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton, that's the way they start off. But those early years with Jordan and then with Benetton, they're flicked over a little bit. But yeah, Eddie Jordan's absence from the film is probably something that stood out to me as well. Do you get a sense of how great a driver he was, and what ability he had and talent he had in the car? Like some of the line, you definitely do, and you probably get it from what his rivals are saying about him. Like, there's a couple of examples. Like, I took fairly detailed notes while I was watching it the other night, but the Ayrton Senna stuff, and there is the Senna documentary itself, which a lot of people will have seen, and there's a little bit of crossover when you're talking about the Senna story, and of course his tragic death at the Imola Grand Prix in San Marino in 1994. But clearly Ayrton Senna was an absolute hero of Michael's, but it got to the point where there's a great clip of the two of them having it out after a race. Senna thought that a young Michael had kind of overstepped the mark in one of the races, and that was Senna's way of saying, okay, I respect you. This is a kid who is dangerous. He's the next generation. And even when Senna was killed in Imola in 1994, the driver behind him who he was trying to stay ahead of was Michael Schumacher. Schumacher was the
didn't know that. That's interesting.
So Schumacher was the person he was trying to stay ahead of when he had that horrific crash into the wall at Imola, and even then you can see the pictures, and they kind of use archive interview of Michael asking him about that day when Michael went on to win that race, because they didn't realise how bad Ayrton Senna's injuries were when he was airlifted. There were no iPhones back then, no breaking news notifications on your phone, so they were kind of getting very little information from the hospital. And you can see the look on Michael's face as someone comes over and whispers to him. It reminded me of, the famous scenes of George W. Bush when someone comes over and whispers to him about the attacks on the Twin Towers in 9/11. There is a look on Michael's face that he's trying to stay calm because he's in the public eye and public sphere and everyone's looking at him. But someone comes over and whispers to him and says he's not in good shape. Ayrton's not in good shape. And the three drivers who are podium, they're told there's going to be no champagne, there's no celebration. The German national anthem is played for Michael, but he is stony-faced and clearly emotional. But the impact that crash had on him, he said he went out to the next race, I think it was the next race, Silverstone, in the British Grand Prix, and he said every single bend that he went around, he thought, this bend could kill me, I could die there, I could die there. He was faced with his own, and probably all the drivers at that time were faced with their own mortality after Ayrton Senna's death. And that's something that he never really thought about before.
Very sad, and obviously took a difficult turn for him then in the Alps a few years later. His career at Ferrari, how much of that is in the documentary?
Like, this is the interesting part of the documentary, and there's a really emotional kind of montage scene when he finally gets over the line and wins a Formula 1 World Championship with Ferrari. Like, he ends up winning 5 in a row. But Eddie Irvine was his teammate at Ferrari for a time, and the car was brutal, to say the least, when they started off. Like, one of the quotes from Eddie Irvine was the basic philosophy of the car was wrong. And there's a race at France in Magny-Cours, and Michael has a it's not even a crash, I think the engine just goes on him basically, and there's a tow truck that comes to take away his Ferrari car, and Michael's sitting in the car still on the back of the tow truck, and I think someone in the doc refers to it as a symbol of impotence. But Michael cared about that car, and he cared about winning in the prancing horse livery, the red of Ferrari. He wanted that win big time, and the battles he had with people like Jacques Villeneuve, and there was a famous race in Barcelona in the rain in '96 that's covered in depth as well, where Villeneuve felt like Michael Schumacher overstepped the mark a little bit, and you kind of see Michael cannot see him doing wrong ever. Like, there was an infamous race at Spa in 1998, and I was at Spa myself, of course, a number of weeks ago, and we didn't exactly see a stellar Grand Prix like this one, but Michael Schumacher in the rain went into the back of David Coulthard. And Coulthard at that point was a teammate of Mika Häkkinen's, and Michael goes into the back of him. He felt like Coulthard maybe brake checked him a little bit and put on the brakes and forced the accident to happen, that Coulthard maybe came off the throttle. But Coulthard, Michael walks across the paddock, famous TV images towards Coulthard to kind of take him on, and I think later Coulthard said to him, "You must be wrong sometimes," and Michael's response was, "Not that I remember." So it was those years with Ferrari are famous in that red livery, but they are well covered, I have to say, in the doc.
Do we get a sense in the documentary how amazing a sports person he was, Michael Schumacher? He wasn't perfect. There was times when he could be quite ruthless on the track, but that amazing brilliance that he had to set the tone and be a 7-time world champion.
Oh, big time. It puts in perspective what Lewis Hamilton is doing, I think, and like or loathe Lewis Hamilton, he is now level with Michael Schumacher on 7 world titles, hoping to make it 8 this year, although Max Verstappen's going to make that quite difficult for him. But there's a great quote from James Allen, Formula 1 journalist in the doc, that says, winning on a sustained level year after year is very, very difficult in Formula 1. And the fact that Michael was able to do it, he could have stayed on with Benetton and perhaps won another world title or whatever with them. He wanted to challenge himself, go to Ferrari, a team that at the time was probably on a downward spiral, and he wanted to take them back to the next level. It's the equivalent maybe of someone like Ronaldo or Messi going to like a smaller tier team to make them what they once were. He wanted that challenge. He wanted to be tested, and I think that's covered quite well in the documentary. He was a restless character as well. Even when he retired, he eventually goes back to Formula 1, makes a return to Mercedes in 2010 alongside Nico Rosberg. Obsessed with skydiving as well. That you can see that in the film. Scuba diving. Someone who was a real adrenaline junkie, and sadly, obviously, the skiing incident that led to his current health condition was linked to that. But really, really fascinating character, and I think people will enjoy the documentary, even if there are some gaps left out.
Okay, Shane Hannon, thanks so much for filling us in on the Michael Schumacher documentary, which is on Netflix now.